Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 296. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. Here today with first-timer on the podcast, but a longtime member of our community, Tom Grant, sometimes known as TP Grant. Tom, how's it going, sir?
It's going really well. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be back and talking about jiu-jitsu world.
I am happy to have you here. Now, as I was saying before, I hate to reuse my jokes, but actually I don't. I love reusing my jokes. As I was saying earlier, with a name like TP Grant, you must have been very popular during the pandemic.
Huh.
So
that was actually a choice I started writing about MMA back when I'm in the education world. I teach middle school. I just tried to make my name slightly less like Googleable in that sense so that parents wouldn't find me. So I just went with an initial. And it was kind of snappy and rolled off the tongue. And that became my writer name for like my whole online jiu-jitsu thing.
Well, let's talk about that. People may think, TP Grant, I've heard that name before. Why don't you tell people who you are and where they may have known you from?
Well, I started writing in the crowdsourcing era, and I was originally on a Bleacher report with a couple of really good writers who would go on. And I was just writing articles, and really the thing I think first people noticed was I wrote a history of jiu-jitsu, and then I transitioned over to Bloody Elbow, and I did a bunch of work for Bloody Elbow, and I absolutely loved it over there. There were some really, really great people, and they gave me a ton of freedom to just write whatever I wanted to do. Like if I thought it was interesting, they let me write an article on it, and then like the 10 other people who thought it was interesting could also get involved. And that seemed to really work. And then after that, I actually wrote for Flow Grappling for a short period of time. And for Friends of the Pod, Inverted Gear, I wrote for them for a while also.
Man, you've been all over the place, but you're not just a writer. You are also a black belt as well, right? So tell me about your training.
So I started training back in 2009, the Restovich Brothers down in Lincoln Square in Chicago. Really wonderful establishment. Like I love the layout. It's just crammed in like an old storefront, and then they like knocked out the walls for another one. No air conditioning, open the back door for training sort of deal. And I was there through Blue Belt before I got a job, and I moved to another of the gyms out in the suburbs. And there I trained under Barry Phillips from Blue to Brown Belt. Barry Phillips is a wonderful, wonderful black belt. He is, I think, in his late 60s or his 70s now. And he is a former D1 track athlete. He was abusing the 20-something blue belts well into his 60s. And then when I had to move again because of a kid and work, I got my black belt under Issac Riggs out in Alliance, Schaumburg. And Isaac is one of those hidden gems of jiu-jitsu where he intentionally makes sure that he has no internet presence, but is one of those guys that's kind of been there and trained with all of the 90s legends sort of deal. And if you talk to guys from that era, they all somehow know him.
Amazing, Tom. Well, what we had talked about discussing here, in the setup when we were talking about ideas and things that you could chat about, you talked about some of the main ideas that you use when you're presenting to your students. And one of the things that you said is making sure they understand that ultimately we're all really just making this up as we go. When we sit down and we explain to someone how to do a technique, kind of comes across like a lecture sometimes, and people assume that, oh, well, this guy must really know everything and he must know exactly how it's done. And if I just follow the steps to the recipe here, I'll be able to repeat his success. But in reality, when you actually are rolling with someone who's resisting, a lot of that goes out the window. You're just making it up as you go. You're trying to do 5 different things at once. You're trying to off balance while set your grips, while deny their grips, while create openings, while distract them. There's so many things to go into rolling effectively. And this is an area where I don't think enough instructors talk about this. They will explain things, but they won't necessarily explain that just following these steps is not going to make you successful. that was a big mindset shift for me at some point. And I really am sad that no one ever sat me down and explained this to me, because I always thought it was like following a recipe. If you knew all of the steps to a move, you could just do it. With that said, though, I'll turn this over to you. Tell me a little bit about how you run a room and how this kind of philosophy fits in when you're instructing your students.
So first of all, I'm basically the beginner's instructor, like the beginner program instructor at my school. The gym that I have has basically handed me the beginner's program. And it's pretty it started out as pretty standard in that sense that we Alliance, and back when I was with the Restoviches, they were originally Gracie Barra before the first big exodus of Gracie Barra schools. And they also had like a set beginner's curriculum. These techniques taught in this way is the basis of jiu-jitsu that introduces you to the sport and the martial art. And I do think there is some value in the exercise of kind of boiling it down to like, what are the essential things that somebody should know? That instruction, especially for beginners, can get way, way too rote. It's far too much. You take this grip with your right hand, you take this grip with your left hand, you put your foot here, and you apply this force at this precise angle, and the person falls over. And that's not how it ever ends up happening. Or more precisely, it does sometimes happen that way, but a lot of other factors often come up that make it not work or have to work differently. And I think one of the things that I enjoy about jiu-jitsu is I came to this as an athlete already. I actually was in Olympic fencing for over a decade before that, and before I did jiu-jitsu, and I was at a Olympic level facility in college. I was at the Ohio State University. Our coach, Vladimir Nazlimov, was a 10-time world champion, the former coach of the Soviet Olympic team, had overseen more gold medals at the Olympics than most people have. His experience was intense, and that sport is very, very different than jiu-jitsu, even though they're both, in the general sense, like a martial sport. Actually, fencing is much more akin to boxing, where like there aren't 15 million techniques to learn. There are only so many angles someone can try to hit you from, and you have a way to parry each of those angles. And defense is a combination of timing, movement, and you properly executing those set few parries. And you got to figure out how to make those work. It's on you to figure out how to make those work. And you're never going to do them the way that if you just dead drill them standing across from somebody and they go to hit you and you go to block it, that's never how it actually happens. And now there's a lot of differences between jiu-jitsu and fencing. But the mindset of the gym in fencing, like a really good gym in fencing, is about finding how you can make the core concept of like a parry work. We give you this hand motion that you use to defend yourself. We give you a foot motion that you use to move about. And then you got to put that together with the timing and the adjustment to the opponent that you're facing to not get hit. And the end result is don't get hit. And when I teach sweeps, for instance, when I'm teaching, I approach things with the idea that I'm trying to arm the student with the ability to teach themselves jiu-jitsu when they stop coming to my class and they just go to practice, as it were. And I very much took that idea of a curriculum and I redesigned it with a few base ideas to build around. And that is, number one, what is the goal of the program? And the goal of the program at our gym is not so much self-defense, it is competitions. We want to send people to competitions and we want to do well at competitions. So I removed a whole bunch of the striking defense. And I know like somewhere like a Gracie is rolling over in their grave, but I took all those out because for the most part, it's not what we're dealing with. And if they want to do that, we have an MMA gym in our association that I can send them to. Like, hey, if you really want to do this with striking, head to this gym like 2 miles north and train there. And they really do cover that sort of deal. But for here, we're really focused on getting good at winning inside rule sets. And also, we live in a pretty nice suburb. If you're regularly getting into street fights, like something's wrong with you and you are the problem. And then the other thing that I do is I look for movements and concepts that are being taught through lessons, and then also creating good training habits for the students that they can take with them going forward. And when it comes to like stuff like concepts, what I mean by that is for sweeps. I teach a sweep. I do like if I teach the scissor sweep, I teach it in the classical way of like a collar grip, a sleeve grip, and then positioning. and all that, but I really want to contextualize everything for the student where it's like, why are we collecting that hand? Why are we pulling them in this direction? Because all sweeps get made up of the same basic things. We need to take our opponent out of position. We need to take away the limb they're going to use to catch themselves, and then we need to push them in the correct direction where they don't have a limb to catch themselves. And I will teach every sweep with those showing this is where we acquire those three things. And then when we train, and I kind of open things up at the end of the class when I can, and we don't spar at the end of every beginner's class, but especially when we've reached like the end of working on a few techniques that are related, we'll open it to just sparring, like a limited set of sparring for people to work through it. And my encouragement is always, don't do it precisely how we do it in drilling. Make it work. If your objective as the bottom player, we just learned a bunch of sweeps, your win condition is you put the other person down and you get up. Like, make it up as you go and use that idea of like, well, I pushed it. I can't get this limb. I can't get his right hand, but I can get his left hand. How can I take him to his left from this position? And things like that. That's like kind of the core of my idea, at least when I start teaching these beginners.
I think that's really good stuff. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think in my entire time doing jiu-jitsu, I've ever hit a technique exactly as it was taught to me, at least not against anyone above white or maybe blue belt. Because against a realistic opponent, someone who's really resisting, you can't just do the steps and get the same result, because the real world just is not choreographed like that. If you get 5 steps through a 10-step sequence and then your opponent moves in a direction that makes the other 5 steps impossible to do, you're screwed. You got to come up with something else. And for a long time, I really thought that there was something deficient in my jiu-jitsu because I couldn't make things work the way that I was being taught. I came up originally starting in a Gracie Baja, like you talked about, so I am well acquainted with their curriculum. And there was a lot of, here are the exact steps and follow them exactly, and it would never work. And what I did find is if I ignored the instructor and did my own thing, maybe I could pull it off. So, maybe I couldn't do that pendulum sweep, but if I just stood up, that would work pretty well. And I felt really bad about this for a long time because I could only get results if I was doing something other than what my instructor taught me. And it took me way too long to realize it was actually not a me problem. It was a them problem. It had to do with their expectation that they could just give me the recipe and I could execute these things directly. All of that fails to take into account the dynamics of a live roll, the challenge of doing stuff against a resisting opponent, and all of the variables, just body types, both for you and the other person, strategies that they may use. I mean, there's a lot of techniques that only work if they're sitting down. If you try to do those against someone who's standing up, that ain't going to work. Things like limb length, both yours and theirs, come into play. And I think that we need to encourage people to play around more with this stuff. You talked about the comparison to other sports where they have a much simpler way of organizing their knowledge. And that's one thing that I've always found interesting about jiu-jitsu. If you look at jiu-jitsu instruction, you would come away thinking that this is one of the most complicated things in the world. And I think that we like it that way. I think jiu-jitsu people like to feel like they're doing something complicated and hard because it makes them feel smart. Hence the whole jiu-jitsu is like chess analogy that people always draw.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at other sports though, you brought up boxing, judo as well, to a lesser degree. They have generally a much simpler and more organized way of looking at things. I mean, boxing, there's only so much you can do. Jiu-jitsu people always say, well, that's because grappling is so dynamic and complicated. But I don't know. I mean, judo, yeah, there's more techniques than in boxing by name, but there's still a relatively defined, organized small group of them, and people are encouraged to focus on a subset of those. Wrestling is much more organized and much easier to understand. And I do feel like sometimes in a rush to conceptualize jiu-jitsu and make it into this big academic exercise, but we just wind up overcomplicating things. And sometimes I think that distracts people because they don't realize this is a dynamic activity. To some extent, you have to make it up yourself.
Yeah, you brought up a couple points there that I want to hit on, and we'll go on the most recent one on this idea of us overcomplicating it. We definitely do. I mean, you see it. There was the entire era of instructionals after Danaher's instructionals came out, where I just always joke that everyone tried to be Dr. Grappler. Like, they're going to explain in detail from the beginning everything they're doing, why they're doing it, sort of thing. And Danaher does go on. Like, when I do his instructionals, I have to skip the first hour because I don't need a dissertation on why it's good to be behind somebody in a fight. Like, I know why that's good. Like, I understand the human body is pointed forwards, sort of thing. Like, I want to get to the actual, like, usable bits. And we do overcomplicate it. There is something to me different about grappling in a lot of ways. And it might be also the rule set that we play in. And the fact that jiu-jitsu has no defined rule set, which I actually really like. I really like that we don't have an Olympic version of our sport. And that's a whole nother discussion. We are never getting an Olympic version of jiu-jitsu, and we should be thankful for that. Being in the Olympics is a great way to ruin your martial sport. And because of that, we train for the totality of what happens when you put hands on another person, or you can. Like, within your gym, you'll focus on certain parts, kind of like how my curriculum focuses on a certain few things. But you could conceivably focus on the totality of anything that happens when you grab another human being. One of the biggest differences for me is, hilariously, one of the most difficult opponents for a high level fencer. And I'm talking like, I've watched people who won Olympic medals struggle with this in the NCAA setting, which is where I fenced, was with the guy in his first year of fencing. The guy in his first year of fencing, under especially a limited number of touches. If it was not a 15-point tournament match, if it was a 5-point NCAA match, you don't need to get into like the specifics on the scoring of fencing, but much more limited time frame to operate. The beginner would just do stupid stuff that could score, and the more experienced fencer would have to adjust to that on the fly, and it was sometimes incredibly difficult. Like, somebody who was weird, who went about things in a weird way. Yeah, their timing was different, or their timing was straight up bad, but still effective, was an extremely difficult opponent. And like, you have these people who could actually make it to like a decent level of the domestic like scene by just being kind of janky. And you don't see that as much in grappling. Like, very rarely is a brown or a black belt troubled by the person who has never grappled before, unless that person is just being like overly violent in a situation when they're supposed to be kind of chill, like, sort of deal. Like, that's the only level. You never end up in a position like, man, I rolled with this guy who's never done any grappling before, and I just couldn't pass his guard, or I just couldn't get out of his mount, like, sort of thing. You never hear that from brown and black belts for the most part. There is something different. I just don't know what it is entirely. There's a lot of factors that go into that. But there is something different about grappling as opposed to fencing. And part of it is that fencing takes place largely in space, like with distance between us, and we're moving for a lot of that. And in that movement and timing, even a well-timed attack can be a mistake if the other person is doing something you don't expect.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the things about jiu-jitsu that is interesting is that it's often about your body being entangled with the other person's body, which makes it quite different from a lot of other sports, because now you get into all of these weird types of entanglements that you can get into. Many other sports are much more about distance and range and positioning and timing and momentum. And in jiu-jitsu, you can build a pretty effective game without a lot of that. There's a lot of people whose jiu-jitsu is very suffocating and slow and controlling. And so there is something different about the sport. But I do think that all in, it winds up leaning towards being overly complicated. And there is a place for that. If you are a brown or a black belt and you're looking to refine your study in a very specific area, you're probably going to be glad that some person out there made a really niche instructional on it. But for most of the people looking to build a foundation of knowledge, a lot of the time, I think they just get confused about how they should grapple effectively in the moment. They feel it's more prescriptive than it is, where it's actually much more experimental. Coaches have known this for quite a while. The Ecological Dynamics coaches, now part of that movement, they really emphasize this, but it's not unique to them. You know, coaches in other sports do this too, where they encourage a lot of play, a lot of time on the field, a lot of experimentation. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, there's still a lot of gyms out there that are very lecture-based, where it's more about, here's the recipe. Follow the recipe and the cookies will come out perfect every time, right? It doesn't work like that when you're talking about arm bars.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not innocent of that on the I liking to lecture part of it, but usually when I do that, again, the focus is not on like, this is how the technique works. It is like, this is conceptually. So while I'm definitely guilty of lecturing, I tend to try to avoid over-opining on the precise things about how a technique is done, and really focusing on the idea of the underlying, how can you make it work regardless of what your opponent is doing, or how can you adapt it regardless of what the opponent's doing? And this brings me to one of the other points I wanted to bring up, because you were talking about this idea that you were doing the things like air quotes wrong. You weren't doing it the way the coach showed, but then that was what worked, sort of thing. And for me, one of the quotes that I always go back to was something that one of my original instructors, Adam Restovich from Chicago, said to me, because there were a lot of, it's still like, they still happen, but back then there were a lot more jiu-jitsu purity discussions about what is and isn't jiu-jitsu versus something else, you know? And he just kind of said, jiu-jitsu's what works. If you're grappling and it works, you're doing jiu-jitsu correctly. Like, that's it. And that kind of mindset always impacted me, where I started cross-training and I started doing other grappling arts, because there wasn't this idea that you had to stay pure to the concept or the idea of what particular style of grappling we're doing, and more just like, if you can make it work, you're doing jiu-jitsu correctly. And if your goal is to get the other person off of you and you do it in a way that doesn't open you to a submission or something else, then you're doing it right. And I think that brings me to another thing. When we're talking about this idea, especially with beginners, there is such a thing as doing something wrong. And that is something that I feel like there's a little bit of the like, hey, just explore and learn, and however you do it, if it works in the situation you're in, then it's correct. But you got to put the context of who they're grappling against in that. And there's an absolute possibility that people can learn bad habits when they're just rolling with other beginners. And so that is when a coach is needed to step in and be like, hey, just so you know, that stiff arm you just used is going to get you armbarred against anybody who's good. So we need you to find a different way. And I know it didn't happen there because he's not good enough. And I usually say this, there are mistakes in grappling that aren't mistakes unless we enforce them as mistakes. Like when someone is grappling with me and they reach across in my guard for a grip that exposes them to an armbar, it's not a mistake unless I armbar them. And I need to be the one that enforces that. And there are plenty of mistakes like that you can kind of get away with for a while, and then you start facing another level of grappler. And then one of the things I always kind of seek for my beginners program is, again, that idea that I'm setting them up to learn jiu-jitsu as they go. I don't want them to have to relearn how to grapple when they hit purple belt, which I think is something that absolutely happens sometimes.
Yeah, I really had to relearn pretty much the entire way I think about jiu-jitsu once I got to brown and black belt, which is actually what led me to start BJJ Mental Models, just the discovery that there were simpler ways to think about things, and trying to think of things in a more complicated fashion actually didn't work as well as just having a few simple ideas and being able to freestyle it depending on what gets thrown at you. So, you bring up a good, interesting point too about beginner mistakes. This is always a fun conversation. When beginners make mistakes, what is the coach's role here? Is the coach's role to slap them on the wrist and tell them don't do that? Or is the coach's role to, as you said, give them a more nuanced answer about when that will and won't work? Or should the coach just step back and just let them figure it out on their own? I mean, there's different thoughts there. I think that the most important thing is just not to give them any absolute answers that might mislead them. If your coach is telling you always do this or never do this, doesn't matter to me how experienced your coach is. I would think twice about that advice, because there are very few situations in jiu-jitsu where always or never accurately describe what's going on. There's usually nuance involved, and most things in jiu-jitsu, there may be a good idea in some situations, maybe a bad idea in other situations, but there's a sliding scale. I mean, the whole stiff arming, right? Extending your arm. There are legitimate times to do that and legitimate strategies to do that, but they're usually much more experienced strategies. You either have to be at the exact specific angle where you can stiff arm safely, or you're intentionally creating an opening in the hopes of baiting your opponent. But neither of those are things that are really going to be likely strategies to use at white belt, right? So I think that, again, as you mentioned here, a lot of jiu-jitsu is the gradual understanding of the nuance over time and realizing that there aren't a lot of hard rules. It's mostly just knowing which tool to pull out of the toolbox at any time. And there might be some things that are just considered awful ideas, but maybe 1 in 100 times it is the right thing. Or maybe for 1 in 100 people, their body type and attributes make it work when it doesn't for anyone else. So again, I think that The most important thing that we can do as a coach is make sure our students aren't thinking in absolutes.
One of the things that I do with mistakes is I tend to mentally categorize them into 3 different categories. And now this is something I'm like realizing as we're talking about this. There's number 1, there's the like, no, seriously, don't do that. Like, don't do that. Don't put your hand on the ground. When you're trying to get up in closed guard, don't plant both hands on the ground and try to push up from the person in closed guard. Bad things are going to happen to you if you're constantly putting your hands on the ground when you're stuck in someone's good closed guard. It's a pretty firm no. Then there are the ones that are like, I have the ones where I'm like, you guys with your like white belts, this is a hard rule that will cease to be a rule when you understand the nuances of it. Like, for right now, don't do this. Later in your career, you will learn how to do this. Crossing the feet on the back, something that I'm like, hey, when you're originally doing this, for the people who are like really new white belts, don't do this. There are ways to do it correctly. You will see experienced grapplers do it correctly. You don't know how they're doing it yet. So I don't want you to do it right now. Like, I want you to focus on this other parts of back control that we're focused on that are more important, like right now. And then with my more experienced grapplers, we start getting into some different positions you can put your feet in to like control the back, start using them. But if I got like a guy on his first or second back control lesson day, I just don't want you to like cross your feet and accidentally get your foot broken by like the blue belt who's excited to finally try out that foot lock he learned and doesn't realize that you have no clue what you're doing, you know? And then there are the ones that I will look at a guy and say, hey, this is a risk. You got to risk stuff in sports. This is something you can do in a bad situation. Like, you're down, you really need to get out of this. You can do that. You just have to understand. You got to go in open-eyed into the risks that you're taking with that. And since you know those are the risks, you may be able to, on the back end, make it work. You may be able to fight out of the armbar that you're exposing yourself for. Just know that you're putting yourself into a potential armbar when you do this sort of deal. So I kind of have those like 3 categories of the no, not right now, and just go in open-eyed sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think when you get into the hard no's, there are few of those in jiu-jitsu, but most of the ones that do exist are around rules and safety. The times when I would say you've got a hard no would be things like, don't bite them, don't gouge their eyes, don't slam them on their neck. A lot of things that you wish were obvious to people, but people do take for granted. In terms of when to speak and when to stay silent, something that you mentioned earlier, which I think is really key, is that there is a time, at least I think there is a time for the coach to talk, and that is when they're explaining why you would do something. I don't mind a 10-minute lecture from a coach if it's a really thoughtful discussion on why things happen a certain way. But where I zone out and where I get a lot less value out of verbal instruction is when it starts to go into the technical details. I just immediately lose my interest for a variety of reasons. Part of it because I don't find it a compelling way to learn. Part of it because after many years of doing this, I'm just jaded and I don't believe it's a good way to learn technique. So I know I'm wasting my time. But also, once you start getting into specifics, there's a lot of nuances around, well, is this even a move I'm really going to use? I mean, if you are not someone who likes using a lot of sleeve grips and the move of the day is some sleeve bullshit that you really don't think you're ever going to use, I mean, some people might say that that is a limiting belief, but my thought is you should actually be pretty in tune with what your game is. And once you get experienced enough, you'll probably have a pretty good idea of what things fit into your game and what don't. So personally, for all of those reasons, that and just the ecological concept that you simply cannot learn a technique by having it communicated to you, I don't see the value in communicating there. But I think that it does help to give people that conceptual understanding of here's how the body works and here's why we're doing what we're doing.
So, first of all, I hate sleep bullshit. I thought they're my least favorite days because I do gi and no gi, and I hate learning things that just disappear when I take the jacket off. Like, just utterly disappear. God, like lasso guard just drives me insane. I don't like doing it. I don't like the pressure it puts on my knee. I don't like that it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in certain rule sets, or if it exists in a rule set, I'm putting myself into potentially bad situations. Like, I know lasso guard works. Believe me, I know. I've lost matches because of lasso guard on me. I know it works. I know how to stop it. I hate when the move of the day is a whole bunch of lasso guard stuff in the practices that I attend, and I'm just like, ah. Secondly, kind of going into that idea of kind of, again, letting people learn and experience. One of the main ways that I teach mistakes is I don't tell people not to do them. A good part of my beginner's curriculum is arming people to punish people for these mistakes that should be punished. Someone tries to bench press you off of mount, here's the arm bar that you do. And like that's a really great arm bar to start teaching the basic concepts of how to move to position yourself behind the arm in the proper position, how to control the arm. And then that leads us into the finished position of where you end up and what are the braking mechanics of an arm bar. Because one of those like big training habits that I try to really instill in people from the beginning is how to do a submission in the gym. And I give this speech all the time about the different types of taps that you're going to get and like the amount of effort that should go into it. And that effort being a reflection of how well you're doing the technique. Because I always say like drilling taps are the easiest taps to get. If you are putting any effort into getting a drilling tap, like where someone, you're just learning the technique or you're helping the other person out and you're getting there. And it's one of those times where I'm like, hey, I want you to do an arm bar from close guard. And if you have to strain to get the tap on that arm bar, something is significantly wrong with that arm bar. And then the next level up, like a resistance tap in like a resistance drill sort of situation. We have set you guys up. The person's not going to be giving it to you. You got to open it. You got to fall back. That level of like, and then moving up to like rolling in the gym. Then like really like competition, and then competition for money where like you might need to break the limb. And this idea that if you know that when you're drilling it, you know you're in the proper position, when you can feel that you're getting the tap and you have a really nice position, when you're putting like 10% of the potential into it. That's the goal. And when you're training, when you're rolling in a rolling situation, you want to be able to control that position. You want to be able to hold them in it. And you want to be able to slowly apply pressure to get a rolling tap, knowing that you had a bunch left over if you actually had to break that limb. And that's a great way for them to focus on refining their control of submissions and making sure that their submissions are real, that their braking mechanics are real without having to like explode into submissions when they're rolling.
That's a good point. In the gym, at least when you're sparring with older, more senior people, more experienced people, you will sometimes get, I don't trust you taps, which is like, I'm not tapping because this is fully locked in. I'm tapping because I think you're legitimately going to try to break something, even if you don't have control. And I don't trust you in this role to continue further. I think that is something that, culturally speaking, if I am training with someone and they try to slam on a submission without control, but with the clear intent to break in practice, I think that's a pretty big indictment of the gym, of the coach, definitely of the student. I'm always extremely concerned when I see that. And again, this is another example of why sometimes as a coach, talking about the why and talking about the how can be more valuable than just teaching techniques. If you just teach people the moves to do, they might lack that nuance, that dial you described, where they understand what the goal is and that it's really about control. So again, like you said, you can get a lot of false positives. You can get taps in the gym that no one in a realistic competition or fight would ever cede just because the person's, maybe they just don't trust you. I mean, I've been in submissions where I have tapped, not because it was really a valid submission, but because this other person was just being ultra aggressive. They were like raking their gi across my face. And it's like, I got to go to work tomorrow, buddy. You know, I'm not going to let you rip the skin off of my face just to get a win in the gym. So sometimes you get taps for that reason, and that can give people a lot of false positives if they're ultra aggressive. They're not really thinking about things through. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying there.
I actually had an experience with this at brown belt. I had a reputation at the gym, the Alliance show I moved to, as a leg lock guy because I really enjoy leg locks. I like learning them. I like doing them. And I was getting ready for a competition. So I was rolling with the other brown and black belts, and we were rolling hard. We were rolling fast, which the general understanding that in those rolls, if I get something, I'm going to start applying it not at full comp speed, but I'm going to assume that you're going to really try to get out of this thing, and I'm going to try to get the tap as quickly and controlled as I can, sort of deal. And I was finding a lot of success with knee bars, like a lot of success with knee bars. I had like worked through a couple sequences, it was like 2018, 2019. I was like really starting to figure this out. And they got to the point where when I was getting knee bars on guys, they were tapping because they knew I knew what I was doing and they knew I liked leg locks. So they were just like, okay, you got me, like sort of thing. And then I got my competition and I got into, I'm forgetting the name of the guy, but he grapples up in like either northern Wisconsin or over the border in Minnesota. Really good competitor. And I got down early by 2. I walked right into a single leg. And time was running out. One of the things, I baited a back take knowing that I was already down on points and that I was going to try to get to a knee bar off of a back take. I got to the knee bar and we made eye contact and he gave me one of those just like, there's 10 seconds left, you're going to have to break it looks. And I couldn't get the tap. I couldn't put enough into it to get the tap. And that was one of those. Immediately after that, I actually messaged another guest of the show, Dave Porter, because he was coming to Illinois in a couple weeks. And I was like, I need to work on my knee bars. I need to completely reevaluate how I finish my knee bars. And since then, I have taken a much more, like a different approach to how I apply them in the gym and how I finish them. And if I really don't think it's there, I won't keep it to the point where someone will tap, like give me a gym tap. I will let it go and move on. I'll try to reacquire it in the better position where I actually know I've got it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another reason why, culturally speaking, we want to encourage people to practice position over submission. It's very easy to get a lot of panic taps in the gym. You can have a submission that you're not really controlling particularly well, but if you are applying sufficient braking force and sufficient aggression, a lot of people will just give up because in the gym it's not worth it. You can get a lot of false positives from that. And when you wind up against someone who's really willing to see it through, often you find out that your control wasn't as good as you thought it was. So again, a lot of this comes back to gym culture, and a lot of this comes back to how the coach expresses to the student what's really important and what isn't. So, if you were to ask me kind of where I sit, it's always worth pointing out, I don't run a gym day to day. I don't really coach classes anymore, but I do talk to a lot of really excellent coaches. And if I were to throw my opinion in based on what people have told me, I think that a combination of using your words to explain the ideas and to explain why, plus a lot of live practice where you give people the ability to experiment and work within the rules, I think that those two things work really well. Where I think mistakes get made is where you flip that around and people expect you to just figure out the concepts and the big ideas on your own, but then they're overly pedantic and prescriptive about how to do the techniques. And unfortunately, a lot of schools are still like that. I know that people will listen to this and they will say, but Steve, is that really still a thing? My gym isn't like that. And I got to say, I get messages from people. There's a lot of gyms out there that still do that. If you are the kind of person who invests your time in listening to something like BJJ Mental Models, you're probably already the kind of person who's learned a lot of these ideas. But there are still so many gyms out there where the black belt is just doing things because that's how his instructor did them, or because that's how the curriculum guide from his franchise says you have to do them.
This gets to another thing about running a program and again, I don't own the gym. I do none of the business side of that. I don't want any part of that. Thank you. I helped with that at a previous place. And man, does it take a lot of the fun out of being at the gym. When I moved, I'm like, guys, I didn't want to do anything in my new gym. I eventually got roped into teaching classes, which I'm fine with because obviously I do it as a profession, but I don't want anything to do with that part. But one of the things you got to understand too, that can make running, especially when you start running a gym. We're an Alliance affiliate. We got a lot of guys who come through. There's a substantial number of grapplers, and this is from white to black belt, who just want to come in and they want to get a sweat in, and they want to roll around, and they want to have a good time, and then they want to go home, and they don't want to think about jiu-jitsu again until they come back in those walls. Jiu-jitsu is those 4 walls, and that's it. And then there are the complete nerds like me and you and several of the students that I like to come to all my stuff that I do besides just my beginners class, who like to really think about jiu-jitsu. But one of the things I do is when I try to bring them in that class, this is the bare basics you need to make the most out of your time when you're here. And it's more than just making sure you do all your burpees so that you feel like you got a workout in sort of deal. It's about taking information from your roles. The best instruction that you get is thinking about your own roles. And then you can build on that. You can go look for videos, you can go look for instructionals, you can ask your coach. But the best information you get is from your own roles because it tells you what you need to work on. And a lot of grapplers just don't take the time to sit back and think about that. They just go yeah, that guy got me because he's X, Y, Z. He's really good at that, or he's really big, or he's just better than me. So that's what it is. So I'm just going to go roll again and maybe it'll go better this time.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, how can a student actually apply all of this stuff, right? If we've talked about the importance of making things up on the fly and understanding how to be innovative and dynamic and how to freestyle, the problem is when we teach, I can only say one thing at a time. No matter how organized my thoughts are, I have to give them to you in sequence. But when you're actually grappling, you're trying to do a whole bunch of stuff at once, right? And I think that this can be a bit of a challenge for people because when they hear things, they hear them in sequence. And so they think maybe that's the way that they need to be applied. But often when you're actually rolling, you might be doing all of those steps at once, or maybe you're doing them out of sequence, or maybe you're bypassing some of the steps because based on what your opponent does, it just doesn't make sense, right? I mean, let me give you an example. When you talk about how to do a lot of techniques, often one of the early steps will be give them a push or a pull to get some kazushi going, right? To get them moving. And the mistake that a lot of people do is if they're doing things in sequence, they'll do the push or the pull, and then their opponent will just retract their arm and get their alignment back. And then the person will say, cool, I did step one, the push pull. Now I'm going to go on to step two. And it doesn't work because the person got their alignment back. And so in a real roll, you are often trying to do many things at once. So I'm probably trying to off balance you at the same time I'm doing other things. It's often in my best interests to give you many threats, many questions at the same time that you all have to answer. So given the natural limitations of our language, where we have to say one thing at a time, how do you communicate to someone that in a real role, they're going to be doing a bunch of things at the same time?
So I think this comes back to like how I start things off, especially when I'm dealing with a person who's never grappled before. And this kind of gets into like a larger debate I had with a good friend of mine about like, is fundamentals even a thing? Does that even exist? Like, is there a core idea of what we should be teaching? And I come back to everything we do is normally contained within like a set of movements that we do on the mat. And that the first thing I should be teaching people are these movements. And a lot of us do them as warm-ups, and a lot of coaches do teach some of them, but then some of them are left like untaught. Every coach will teach you how to do the hip escape. Not as many of them teach you how to do the reverse hip escape. A lot of them just leave that as part of the drill, where like if you're hip escaping in place, you hip escape to one side, and then you come back to set, and then you hip escape back to the other side. And within that drill is the reverse hip escape, but it's never directly called out. It's never directly taught, sort of deal. So I will, when I warm up with students, we do a lot of the solo movements and like a lot of the classic movements, but then part of the class is me contextualizing that, like, instead of saying like step one is doing this and step two is doing this, a lot of times we talk about getting to a position or a grip and then you do X movement. And I don't need to like, you push, pull, and then you do this. I will have already taught them what they're doing with their body. And then we're saying, okay, we're going to get here. You're going to get this. You're going to get, like, again, this grip because I need to deny him this base on this side. Maybe that grip isn't going to do it. Maybe a different grip will do it. But, like, we're going to do this grip right now because this one's easy to learn. And then we're going to do this movement. And that then helps them do it a little bit more naturally, I find. And a lot of times it calls out where I'm, like, saying, like, okay, and now you're doing the same movement we did in warm up. And now we're going to do it right here underneath this person to do like the John Wayne sweep or to do the hip, like the bump from guard or the bump from mount to guard sort of thing. And having that focus be on initially learning how to move your body and then learning how to get the grips to apply that movement in that. Because in a lot of instances, for me, I don't like to teach like those, oh God, you brought it up earlier, but like those 10 move sequences of like, well, you get this and then you move here and then you put your foot there and then you readjust and then you grab this and then you do that. And at the end of this like Rube Goldberg of a technique, the person drops to their hip and you're able to go into your next Rube Goldberg technique. Those drive me like absolutely insane. For me, it's much more useful to say like to partition that off. And it's like, hey, I'm going to do this arm drag from close guard. My goal is to get on this angle and have my arm here, like across the back, gripping the lat. You can grip the gi if you're in gi. Then that position is our goal. We want to get there because that position is like a hub. It offers us a lot of options and you've got such an advantageous grip. You can make it up from here as you go. I'm going to arm you with like the three most common options, but then we're going to start are sparring today in that grip. And the objective of the person on the grip is to either get the back or sweep them or get on top or get out from under them in some way. And the person on bottom, their job is to get out of there. And that's when you start seeing the guys who wrestled, who are playing guard, who then figure out how they can use this grip to get up and not hit a sweep, not go to the back, but like get up to a front headlock without me having to teach that sort of deal. Because I've given them the goal of like, this is the position that we're looking for. And it's not this elaborate thing. It's an arm drag. We're doing one grip fighting thing. We're changing our angle. We're using our little closed guard hip escape movement that we just warmed up with. And then we're sitting up and grabbing their back. And now we have a position that you can work with.
Can I just say, the fact that you described step-by-step instruction as a Rube Goldberg machine, I fucking love that.
So many techniques that I'm like, that's just a Rube Goldberg machine. And there's like, I get that some people love making that stuff work. It's fun, but like, man, I don't know if you can build a game off of that.
Yeah, I will say this. For those who don't know, by the way, what a Rube Goldberg machine is, it's one of those things, I mean, you can find YouTube videos of this where people build these big, elaborate sequences of stuff where maybe you drop a pinball and then it rolls down a funnel and then it lands on something and then that pulls a string and it's just a whole bunch of random bullshit, right? And now, I don't know if you, Tom, have ever actually built a Rube Goldberg machine. I have. And let me tell you, they never work.
Nope.
You might have to try like 5 times to get it to work just once because sometimes the ball will roll in the wrong direction or it won't pull the lever enough. And so the lesson there is if you're trying to build techniques like a Rube Goldberg machine, you have to understand that in the majority of cases, they just don't work because you can't accurately and realistically knock off a bunch of moves like that and make them work perfectly every time. And it's even more complicated in jiu-jitsu because unlike a traditional Rube Goldberg machine, in jiu-jitsu, the machine is fighting back, right? They're going to be moving and doing their own thing. So it's a very challenging way to think of things. Something that Margot Ciccarelli once said on the podcast is, find the timing where the technique becomes effortless. And I love that quote because a lot of the time we're looking for a technique, but the timing isn't there. I mean, if you are in full alignment and I try to hit a scissor sweep on you, it is never going to work. It doesn't matter if I do the steps perfectly. It doesn't matter if Carlos Gracie Sr. would have nodded down on me from heaven because I did it just the way that he would have envisioned. It doesn't work if the person's in alignment. But that said, if I'm focusing on breaking their alignment, so a lot of pushes and pulls and dynamic movement, trying to isolate a lever, trying to make sure they can't connect with the floor and get their base, if I can catch them in a window where suddenly they're off balance, I can do the ugliest scissor sweep in the world, and it's probably going to work at that point. So a big shift in my thinking was moving away from trying to just do the technique and focusing more on how can I just be always attacking their alignment. And then once you see that opening, it becomes much easier to just do whatever technique is there in front of you.
Yeah, we're going back to my old instructor, Adam Restovich. He made a video a while ago. This is a long time ago, but he made a video about the concept of the open guard. And it was in the absolute heart of the 2010s, like the open guard. It was in the midst of guard pulling was ruining jiu-jitsu, of course. The berimbolo was ruining jiu-jitsu. The 50-50 was ruining jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu was being ruined in so many ways. And everyone was really, really focused on learning the open guard. I'm sure you remember this era.
I remember my instructor saying, Steve, closed guard, closed mind.
Yeah. Oh man, that does bring back some memories. That was that era. And the tendency that we have to overcomplicate things. Jiu-jitsu likes to name things to make it a more specific conversation. And there is a great use for that. However, when you start doing that, I think in open guard, it gets everything gets sequestered. And people start thinking themselves as, well, I'm a De La Riva player, or I'm a single leg X guy, or I'm XYZ. I play this guard. I'm a butterfly guy. Okay. Like sort of thing. And that's the complete wrong way to go about it. And Adam made this video about how the open guard is just all 4 limbs are making a different grip. And what you do from there is just a grip set. You're just using a grip set. And to stop thinking like it's just open guard and you take different grips. And to start thinking about it in that way, where you don't like block yourself off, you keep yourself moving through the concept of like, well, guard is just grips. It's just grips and angles. And what can you do from those? And then for me, that was when I started really getting good at guard, because I started connecting the things that I like together. And it includes stuff like, how can I get from closed guard to this place? How can I get from butterfly guard to this place? I very much like inside positions on guard. I prefer places like butterfly guard and single leg X guard and X guard and all of those things. I still also like a bunch of different half guards. I love knee shield / reverse de la Hiva. They're the same thing. I love, one of my current coaches calls it wedge guard, but it's K. Everyone calls it K guard because he was doing it back in like the 90s and it had a different name, because that's a whole nother topic for a podcast, how everything that we've done has come back around. That's one of the other things about when I'm teaching, is kind of keeping that idea that don't get overly caught up in the technique you're doing or the name it has. Get more focused on why it works, and then you will be in better touch with why you do it.
Yeah, that's a great illustration. And something that you brought up there, which I want to touch on, labeling, putting names onto things. We do this way too thoughtlessly in jiu-jitsu, where people will just throw a name on something because they think it needs a name. But when you name something, you give it an identity and you change the way that people think about that thing. Naming things should have a lot more thought put into it than I think people do in jiu-jitsu. First of all, the consistency in naming in jiu-jitsu is just all over the place.
You don't like playing inside Senkaku 411 honey hole saddle.
I once had a very confusing discussion with a very well-known grappler because we could not agree on whether something was called quarter mount or three-quarter mount, or quarter guard or three-quarter guard.
I think was that in your Discord? I think I might have been a party to that conversation.
But yeah, it's the consistency's all over the place. And I'm not just talking about the fact that some moves are named descriptively in English, some are named in Portuguese, some are named in Japanese, some are named after letters of the alphabet or numbers or the people who popularized them. Some of them are joke names. Putting all of that aside, just the fact that you give a name to something, when you give it an identity, you change the way that people think about it. And when you try to throw names at everything, you greatly complexify the sport in a way that I'm not sure is really for the best. You know, when people talk about things like the difference between knee shield guard and Z guard and 93 guard, like at this point we're nitpicking at such a level that I don't really know it's even worth discussing. You're better just thinking of this as a much more simple concept. It's a half guard with a frame. It really, if you overcomplicate it, you make it harder to communicate things. And I think that a big part of effective coaching is simplifying your language so that your students don't have to pull out the dictionary of jiu-jitsu just to understand what you're talking about. You should, as a coach, be able to distill the language down into something that just immediately makes sense. And I think that the choice of words there is very important. The other thing about when you put a label on something is you turn off part of people's brains. People just don't question things anymore once you put a label on something. I mean, in arguments, there's this concept of a thought-terminating cliche, where if you spit out the right catchphrase of the moment, you can just get people to dismiss an entire argument because you use a certain word that just turns off that part of the brain. Just, we don't engage with that anymore because we put a label on this thing and we don't like that label, so we're not touching it. And in jiu-jitsu, I think, again, when you throw out names too casually, you complexify the sport, and you also make the mistake of creating a situation where students don't question things anymore because it's an established name. And so, again, I just encourage people to be very careful before they throw out names. I know we all like to feel like innovators. We all want to put our stamp on the sport. We all want to have something named after us, but I don't think that's the best way to communicate to students.
I very much agree with that. Again, this gets, if you really look at grappling and what I did like the histories of it, the idea of inventing something truly new in grappling is pretty rare. You may come up with a personal variation of it. It's quite likely that someone else at some point also did that. There is a rush to claim ownership that goes back to the very beginnings of this art. Like, if we're being honest, like, just remember that this art it started as, like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started as Brazilian carnival sideshow fights. And there was a certain amount of talking shit involved, and claiming ownership of a style or something like that was a great way to get attention. So, like, it's been baked into this art from the beginning, and it's not always the most positive thing. There can be some, I'm trying to think of some good applications of it, but like most of the time, it's better not to claim ownership out of it and just kind of teach like why you do it that way rather than I have created this system. But they're given you make more money if you do it the other way. So maybe that's the kicker.
Well, I mean, what is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu if not an attempt to claim ownership over judo, right? That's basically what it is. It was a variant of judo that a bunch of people decided they wanted to brand as their own. And I don't take away from that. I understand why you would do that. I understand why they felt it was distinct enough to do that. But at the same time, the more labels you throw out there, the more challenging you make things. To some extent, we do need labels and names. If we didn't have a common name for an armbar, it would be really hard to discuss jiu-jitsu with other people because these things that you see over and over and over again, at some point it just becomes difficult to communicate if you don't have a name for things. But that doesn't mean that every single thing needs its own identity because at some point jiu-jitsu becomes impenetrable to people. And I also don't think that really helps us learn. I mean, it might help us feel smarter to some degree, but I don't think it really helps people get better at jiu-jitsu if every single thing must be named and the language of the sport becomes so complicated that people can't understand it anymore.
Yeah, there's definitely a part of it where it's useful. And then there's a point that you cross where it becomes more of a challenge. There is absolutely a value between delineating between mount and like half guard. Those are two different things. We give them different names and we can clearly identify what makes them different in terms of positioning and then what happens from there. But yeah, completely renaming a guard because my left hand is gripping here instead of there is an overcomplication that doesn't need to exist. Or like one of my friends slash athletes we were talking a little bit about like leg entanglements. And I brought up Josh Hayden and his initial innovations like the 50-50. And then when I mentioned that he called his thing 80-20, he gave me the biggest eye roll. And I'm like, yeah, I know. He named it. Like sort of thing. We all like, it's just what people do. It's just what people in jiu-jitsu do. They come up with like, I changed the angle of my knee. I'm naming it.
Well, great chat, Tom. Anything else that you wanted to cover here that we didn't get into yet?
Oh man, I think there is a show somewhere with somebody with a little bit more firsthand experience in this idea that a lot of what is cool now is one of those things where it's just the thing they were doing in the 90s sort of deal. For me, body lock passing was one of those big things that I wanted to get back into the writing game briefly. I wanted to do a piece about looking at Marcelo's old ADCC runs and the types of passing he was facing that he used the butterfly guard to defeat and then like comparing it to the body locking of today sort of deal. And I just didn't have the time. That we touched on that a few times that I find really interesting, but it had nothing to do with the actual topic at hand. Other than that, I feel like we hit a lot of the points I wanted to kind of touch on here on that idea of I try to have a slightly, while teaching specific things, to give somebody something to try to apply in the gym, I always try to give it that like broader pulled back sense of the end goal is to be good enough at jiu-jitsu to learn how to do jiu-jitsu on your own so that you can leave the beginner's class and you can go into a practice or an open sparring class and just be able to learn in those situations also. And it just takes a little bit of like a headspace sort of setting. And that's the big thing that I try to give guys when they come through my program.
Awesome, man. Well, if people want to check out your work or if they want to follow you or get in touch with you, how do they go about doing that?
Unfortunately, I'm mostly off socials at this point. I have left the rotting corpse of Twitter finally. I'm still there. I just don't have it. I just don't go on there anymore. I took it off my phone. If you want to come see me, if you're ever in Schaumburg in Illinois, west of Chicago, come on out to Evolution MMA and train. Other than that, I am mostly active in jiu-jitsu on the internet in the Mental Models Discord. That's my main place now.
Amazing, man. Well, geez, that's a great transition. Yeah, if anyone wants to get in there, being a member of BJJ Mental Models Premium is how you get your access pass to the Discord. There's a lot of other reasons why you'd want to join BJJ Mental Models Premium. In addition to the Discord access, you get a ton of audio content, over 100 hours, I believe now, of courses, plus premium podcasts from folks like Emily Kwok, Joe Hannon, Drew Foster. We're always looking to expand the value offering on BJJ Mental Models Premium. So beyond all of the courses and all of the audio, we've also started doing camps recently. Tom, I hope I get to meet you at one of these one day. There's a lot of people in our community in Chicago, so I've been trying to figure out an excuse to go out there at some point, but we've been recording the footage from the camps, putting that up on the site, and As you mentioned, we've also got our awesome premium community, so I definitely recommend people check that out. The first week is free, and it helps run everything we do here, so please do consider joining if you haven't already. All of that's at bjjmentalmodels.com, but I will put a link in the show notes. Tom, anything else you want to add? I mean, you've been a subscriber for a while. Any thoughts? Give me some honest feedback here.
Oh, man. When I joined the BJJ Mental Models Discord, I was looking for a place to talk about jiu-jitsu because of the declining state of social media generally. But honestly, as someone who's been around the internet scene for a while, my initial thoughts were this was like when BJJ Reddit was good. A bunch of the mods that I knew from there were in there. A bunch of individuals that I know in real life from the inverted gear people and stuff like that are all in there. It's a large chunk of my favorite people from the last 15 years of jiu-jitsu internet experience in one place.
I do enjoy the fact that a whole bunch of the former Reddit mods have defected to the BJJ Mental Models Discord. But yeah, well, man, I can't thank you enough for supporting us all this time. I also can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It was great to finally chat in person. Like you said, I think there's probably another chat to have there at some point about the cyclical nature of jiu-jitsu, because, I mean, once you get old enough, you do start to see it. What is old becomes new again.
I'm old enough to remember when shotgun ankle locks were wrong.
I'm old enough to remember when ankle locks were wrong.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Tom, for coming by, man. This was a great chat. It was great to connect. And thanks to the listeners as well. We'll talk to you next time. Take care. See you soon.